draconian jail sentences to hundreds of people for protesting for their rights. And in Nicaragua, the authoritarian government continues to detain political prisoners and hold them in appalling prison conditions. The 2022 Human Rights Report is also a reminder of the extraordinary courage that so many activists, journalists, lawyers, government officials, regular citizens who stand up to these abuses. Many do so at great personal risk of retaliation, harassment, detention, torture, even death. In February, we celebrated 10 Global Human Rights Defender awardees, individuals from around the world who are promoting and defending fundamental freedoms, from combating slavery to advocating for families of those forcibly disappeared, to demanding better wages and working conditions for low-income laborers, to representing political prisoners on death row. This report honors them. I'm also proud of my colleagues here at the State Department, in Washington, and at every post around the world, for not only reporting and documenting human rights abuses, but also drawing on the power and purpose of American diplomacy to advance human dignity. Now, as you know, I recently traveled to Ethiopia, where I had a very productive discussion with Prime Minister Abiy and his team. I also met with Getachew Reda, the TPLF signatory to the November 2nd Cessation of Hostilities Agreement, who was just selected to be the leader of its interim administration. I commended both sides for reaching that agreement and the significant progress made in its implementation. With this agreement in place, the fighting is stopped. Humanitarian assistance is flowing. Services are being restored. Human rights in northern Ethiopia are significantly down. Eritrean forces are leaving. The Ethiopian government is taking the first steps toward transitional justice. But as I discussed with both sides during my visit, to build a durable peace, there must be acknowledgement of the atrocities committed by all parties, as well as accountability together with reconciliation. The conflict in northern Ethiopia was devastating. Men, women, and children were killed. Women and girls were subject to horrific forms of sexual violence. Thousands were forcibly displaced from their homes. Entire communities were specifically targeted based on their ethnicity. Many of these actions were not random or a mere byproduct of war. They were calculated and deliberate. After the department's careful review of the law and the facts, I've determined that members of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, Eritrean Defense Forces, Tigray People's Liberation Front forces, and Amhara forces committed war crimes during the conflict in northern Ethiopia. Members of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, the Eritrean Defense Forces, and Amhara forces also committed crimes against humanity, including murder, rape, and other forms of sexual violence and persecution. Members of the Amhara forces committed the crime against humanity of deportation or forcible transfer and committed ethnic cleansing through their treatment of Tigrayans in western Tigray. We welcome the commitment that the parties to the Cessation of Hostilities Agreement have made to acknowledge the atrocities committed and their devastating consequences. The government of Ethiopia is taking the first steps by publicly releasing a detailed green paper of transitional justice options based upon best practices and building upon the experiences of other states emerging from periods of mass violence. It has invited experts from the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights to join the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission to deploy a team of human rights monitors to conflict-affected areas to ensure that such acts have truly ceased. The government is also holding public consultations about transitional justice, which, as I discussed with the Prime Minister, should be inclusive of all stakeholders and provide victims a voice. The process is benefiting from the advice of experts in the field, including members of my team who participated in a workshop on transitional justice with other international specialists just last week. Finally and crucially, we urge the government of Ethiopia and the government of Eritrea, as well as the TPLF, to hold those responsible for these atrocities accountable. These steps, acknowledgement, accountability, reconciliation, are key to breaking the cycle of ethnic and political violence that has gripped Ethiopia and prevented it from reaching its unlimited potential for so long. The United States will partner with Ethiopia as it implements a credible transitional justice process for the benefit of all victims and affected communities. We'll stand with Ethiopia as it honestly faces the abuses in its past, provides accountability for the harms committed against its citizens, and moves towards a future of lasting peace. With that, happy to take a couple of questions before turning it over to my colleagues.
Matt, go ahead.
Matt.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and welcome back.
Thank you.
I've got about 17 questions, but for the sake
Hold
of
on, let me get my pen out.
but for the sake of both you and my colleagues, I'll narrow it down to just one.
Thank you.
And that has to do with the Ethiopia and the decision you just made. As you noted, you were just there. Why didn't you make this determination either while you were there or before you went? Were your conversations while you were there instructive in making this? And then the other thing is on this, you seem to suggest that you think that Ethiopian courts can take care, can deal with this. That is not so much the case as it relates to Russia and Ukraine. And I'm just wondering why it is that you think that.
Thanks, Matt. Well, look, I'm obviously not going to get into the details of private discussions that I had, but two things. First, this determination is the product of a lot of very deliberate, detailed work. And we are, when we make these determinations, very focused on doing that work, making sure that we have the facts, that we apply them to the law, and all of that takes time and focus. It seemed appropriate to release the determination that we made as we're putting out the human rights report. And beyond that, I'd say that in terms of what happens next in Ethiopia, including what process they establish to provide for justice, for accountability, we'll see. I don't think that's been determined. What has been determined, and what I could see from my meetings and conversations last week, is a commitment on all sides to engage in this process of transitional justice, an acknowledgement of the atrocities that have been committed, again, by all sides in the course of this conflict in northern Ethiopia, and I believe a commitment to genuinely get to a better place that has to include accountability, that has to include, I think, reconciliation, if we're going to have a truly durable peace. That's what I heard on the trip. And again, I think the situation that we're seeing now in Ethiopia is vastly different than situations in other parts of the world, in that over the last 4 months, the steps that all sides have taken to implement the cessation of hostilities agreement has literally saved lives and changed lives for tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. But that doesn't erase what happened over the last 2 years, which is why it is so important that we get this transitional justice process moving, and that there is accountability as well as reconciliation.
Mr. Secretary, Afghan situation also is very bad. Any message for our New Year? We celebrated our New Year. Please, you guys don't give me opportunity, any comment about Afghan women, and what's your message for our New Year? We celebrated, but Afghan women crying. I know you don't give me a chance. Sorry, I have a lot of pain.
No, I'm happy to address that. I'll say very simply that we deplore the edicts that the Taliban have promulgated repeatedly that fundamentally repress the rights of Afghan women and girls. And we've seen this now time and again, denying them education, denying them the ability to work, denying them the ability to participate in the provision of humanitarian assistance that benefits all Afghans. And I think it's safe to say from conversations with countries around the world that to the extent the Taliban is looking for more normal relations with countries around the world, that will not happen in so long as they continue to advance these repressive edicts against women and girls.
Thank you. Thanks so much for coming to talk to us about the report. What would your response be to those that would say, you know, despite the contents of the report and despite all the work that goes into it, that the issues that are flagged are not sufficiently influencing policy making, especially when it comes to countries where it is harder for the United States to have those tough discussions on human rights, like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Israel? What's your response to that?
Well, first, we have those tough discussions across the board with friends, adversaries, competitors alike. So and the report itself makes that very clear. But in the day in, day out, it's the same thing. So we don't we're not pulling our punches with anyone, as we call things as we see them. Sometimes we do it more publicly, sometimes we do it more privately. We're trying to determine in each instance how we hopefully can be most effective in advancing human rights, in advancing human dignity. So I think it's safe to say, without getting into details, that we raise these concerns with everyone. Again, friends, adversaries, competitors. At the same time, as we're working in different ways with different countries, we have a multiplicity of interests that we're working on, and we always try to determine how we can most effectively advance them. Human rights is a central interest of ours. It's not the only one. My responsibility is to make sure that we're doing our best to advance all of our interests however we can. But as this report makes clear, and it's the fact that it's a very public report and that it applies the same standards to countries around the world, whatever their relationship with us, I think demonstrates the seriousness with which we take this issue.
Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Secretary.
I'll leave it in the very capable hands of my colleagues.
Thank you,
everyone.
everybody. All right, thanks, everybody. I'm going to turn the floor over now to Assistant Secretary Barclay, who's going to make some remarks, and then her and Ambassador Van Schack are on hand to address some other questions you all might have. Assistant Secretary, please.
Thank you all. Good, almost 1 minute to the afternoon. As Vedant said, my name is Erin Barclay, and it is really an honor for me to be here with all of you for the release of the 47th Annual Country Report on Human Rights Practices, which we submitted to the United States Congress today. As Vedant noted, I've had the great privilege of leading the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor team since September of 2022. And I am extremely proud of DRL for being at the forefront of preparing these important reports with colleagues across the department and U.S. missions abroad. Since 1976, as required by Congress, the United States has issued the country reports on human rights practices, affectionately called the Human Rights Report, addressing the status of internationally recognized human rights in all countries that are members of the United Nations. These reports support the U.S. goal of advancing individual liberty and democratic freedoms around the world, and upholding the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which this year celebrates its 75th anniversary. Adopted on December 10, 1948, in the wake of the Second World War, the Universal Declaration is the founding document of our international order. Under the leadership of Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the first chairperson of the Committee on Human Rights, the adoption of the Universal Declaration marked the first time in history that we had a shared global vision to promote a peaceful future of all nations by advancing the human rights, as the Secretary said, of everyone, everywhere. In recognizing this milestone of its 75th anniversary, we have reaffirmed the legacy, relevance, and the fundamental truth the Universal Declaration enshrines. That is, that all individuals are born equal in dignity and rights, that all governments have a responsibility and a role to play in protecting those universal human rights. Today, this truth beats in the hearts of people around the world who, in the face of injustice and oppression, courageously call upon governments to respect the exercise of human rights and the fundamental freedoms of expression, peaceful assembly and association, and religion or belief. The United States stands in solidarity with these human rights defenders, as well as with members of marginalized groups who are often denied equal protection under the law and targeted for violence, including women and girls, those belonging to racial, religious, or ethnic minority groups, LGBTIQ+ persons, and persons with disabilities. As we support pro-democracy activists, we have seen people in governments in every region of the world unite in condemning human rights abuses. As Secretary Blinken discussed in his remarks, the Kremlin's brutal continued war against Ukraine underscores the need to hold to account those who commit unconscionable abuses, including against children. The egregious and repeated abuses Russia's forces continue to commit in Ukraine are far from the only abuses perpetrated in 2022 by governments and other malign actors across the globe, though, as the Human Rights Report lays out. We must continue to shine a spotlight on abuses wherever and however they are committed, mobilize global urgency in stopping and preventing them, and hold perpetrators to account. Disinformation and misinformation around the globe further threaten democracy and human rights, And one contribution the Human Rights Report makes is to bring facts to the table. The report's annual publication also makes clear the priority the United States places year-round on advancing human dignity and freedom, and reiterates our commitment to these issues in all countries, no matter, as the Secretary said, whether they are partners or adversaries. The Biden administration has put human rights and democracy at the center of our foreign policy, and one signature way the administration is promoting worldwide respect for human rights and democratic principles is by hosting the Summit for Democracy. Next week, March 29th and 30th, the United States will host the second Summit for Democracy with the governments of Costa Rica, the Republic of Korea, the Netherlands, and the Republic of Zambia. We are thrilled to have these 4 partners join us in co-hosting the summit this year. President Biden, joined by leaders from the co-host nations, will assemble world leaders in a virtual plenary, leader-level plenary, followed by a series of hybrid gatherings with representatives from governments, civil society, and the private sector in each of the co-hosted locations. Stay tuned next week for more about the summit. At the conclusion of this press briefing, the 2022 Human Rights Report will be available to the public on the State Department's website. Thank you for being here today, and I'm happy to take a few questions.
Great. Daphne?
Thank you so much. Human rights advocates have raised concerns about treatment of dissidents and minorities in India. Human Rights Watch in 2019 said the Indian government's policies targeted minorities. The Indian government recently banned a BBC documentary and then raided the BBC's offices, and India is ranked 150th in the Press Freedom Index. Blinken has raised concerns about the rise of rights abuses in India last year without going into specific incidents. Are you concerned by India's treatment of minorities and dissidents and by the state of press freedom in the country? And have you raised these concerns directly with Indian counterparts?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. As the Secretary said, we raise the difficult issues in all of our conversations with our partners. The U.S. and India regularly consult at the highest levels on democracy and human rights issues. We have and we will continue to strongly urge India to uphold its human rights obligations and commitments. Not surprisingly, we also regularly meet with civil society, both in the U.S. and in India to hear their perspectives and learn from their experiences. And we encourage the government of India to consult with them as well. On the BBC issue, we're of course aware of the BBC issues, and we will continue to support free press around the world and have communicated the same.
Great. Go ahead.
Thank you. Vedant. On the West Bank, on the occupied West Bank, a very quick question. Does this administration consider the demolition of a Palestinian perpetrator's home or the arrest of his siblings or his parents to be collective punishment? And if so, does that fall under, does that qualify as a war crime? And second, do you expect that the Palestinian organizations, human rights organizations, that were shut down on October 26, 2021 to be reopened anytime soon? Thank you.
Thanks very much for your question. The U.S. is committed to advancing human rights in Israel and in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. As the President and Secretary Blinken have said, Israelis and Palestinians deserve equal measures of freedom, security, opportunity, justice, and integrity. Promoting human rights and fundamental freedoms is critical to their own right, and it also helps them preserve space for a two-state negotiated solution.
Does the demolition of homes and arresting of relatives and parents and siblings and so on qualify as collective punishment in your view?
I'm not going to comment on that at this point, but I'm happy to talk to you.
Can I just get in? This is something that just happened yesterday, right? But Israel's finance minister made some comments in Paris about Palestinians not being a people. Is that something that falls under your purview? Something you can comment on? I'm sorry, it's a DRL question, right? I mean, if you want to answer it, that's fine. But I mean, this is something that happened last night. This is a guy who's not been without controversy before, and these latest comments are just, seem to add fuel to the fire. So, what do you think about that? What do you think about an Israeli cabinet minister saying that the Palestinian people don't exist?
Matt, I think we'll let the Assistant Secretary speak to any questions about the report, but on the comment about the finance minister broadly, Look, I think what I would say is I've not seen those comments specifically, but certainly it's something that we would.
I'm sorry, that's just.
I've not seen those comments specifically, but we of course would take issue with that kind of description or that kind of language being used. But we're gonna get back to questions about the report. Alex, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for coming down here. I have two questions. First, about housekeeping. The fact that
I'm sorry, say that
the first part of my question is about housekeeping. The fact that we still have acting assistant secretary on this role. How much of this takes away from let's say the success stories that you might actually put out there? Second part of the question, more broadly, the question was asked to the secretary about the tools in your toolkit. I cover House caucuses. All the cases I raised throughout the year, last year in this room, are in the report. But those folks are in jail. In Azerbaijan, Ali Aliyev, Bakhtiyar Hajiyev, in Georgia, President Saakashvili, in Russia, Karamurza, and others. Is it a reflection of the fact that you are running out of your tools in that part of the world? Thanks so much.
Thanks for your question, especially the first one, because it gives me an opportunity to brag about my bureau. So let me say this about the DRL Bureau. It is a bureau full of committed public servants who every day come into work and do the job for the American people. I'm extremely proud of them, and the administration is very fortunate to have all of the DRL team in place doing exactly what the administration's policies are on democracy, human rights, and labor. On your second question about the reports in terms of events that are reported year upon year, I think part of that is a reflection of how long the trajectory is in many cases to do better on human rights. And we see international reporting in that space, some of which shows sometimes it's a generational change. That doesn't mean we don't continue to raise those issues. You mentioned issues of political prisoners. This is front and center in all of our diplomacy, bilaterally and multilaterally. We regularly raise cases, individual cases of political prisoners with appropriate officials, and we will continue to do that going forward.
You had your hand up? Go ahead.
Thank you. Anela Khan from the Epoch Times. Thank you for taking our questions today. Mike, I saw that you mentioned forced organ harvesting in China in your report. So as you may know, there is mounting evidence that the Chinese Communist Party continues to harvest organs from living individuals, primarily Falun Gong practitioners. Congress has introduced bills targeting offenders. Where does the State Department stand on holding the CCP accountable for organ harvesting, and what steps are you planning to take to put an end to this atrocity?
So I'm not going to comment on the legislation specifically. We are tracking it. I'm aware of it. Organ harvesting has been a part of the human rights report, has been reported on there. And we will continue to focus on that as an issue across, on the broad spectrum of human rights and trafficking issues going forward where it comes up.
Thank you. So I read the report on Georgia, 57 pages covering the issues on Georgia, and there is a really, really grim picture that the report suggests. You met the foreign minister in Geneva, I think 3 weeks ago. Have you raised those issues with him? You mentioned that you talk about the political prisoners to Alex's question. So have you raised the issue about the Saakashvili with him?
Thanks very much for your question. And I did have the opportunity to meet with the Georgian foreign minister when I was in Geneva for Human Rights Council high-level week a couple weeks ago. And I'm not going to comment on the specifics of my conversations with the foreign minister, but we raised the spectrum of issues, many of which the report articulates, and I'll leave it at that.
Okay, and just to follow up, so there is a growing concern that Georgia is moving towards Moscow. There's a growing authoritarianism, Russian oligarchy, total disrespect to rule of law and freedom of media, freedom of speech, etc. So what is the general sense about Georgia in the State Department? Because if you look at the dynamic of those reports, if you look at the past years, they also suggest a really grim picture of Georgia. So are those issues, concerns stay on paper, or do you actually do something about it?
Yeah, no, thanks very much for the question. It's important. It doesn't just stay on paper. These are issues that we talk to the Georgian government about. And as you know, we have a 30-plus year partnership with the government of Georgia, and that
People of Georgia.
the people of Georgia, thank you very much. I appreciate that correction. And we want to continue to work together with the people of Georgia to move towards their Euro-Atlantic ambitions.
You get your hand up in the back, and then Kylie will come to you after that. Yeah, you go ahead.
Hi, I just want to follow up on China real quick. Can you share more details on when was the last communication with China counterparts on human rights cases? And also, I know that Secretary Blinken has made his remark in the opening about China and Russia, but is there any concern from the State Department that given those countries they don't have good human rights record according to the report, is there any concerns that the two leaders get closer and there will be more human rights abuse cases coming from those two countries? And the third one is China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs just published a report basically pointing fingers at the United States is called the state of democracy in the U.S., accusing the U.S. of doing that. Any comments or response to that?
Sure. Let me pick up your last question first. So we always welcome critique of the human rights situation in our country, as long as it is credible and fact-based and objective. We regularly submit ourselves to various processes in the UN, for example, Universal Periodic Review at the Human Rights Council. We recently reported to the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and other treaty bodies. So as the Secretary said, we don't sweep our problems under the rug. We are ready to shine a light on them and work to improve them in our own country. On your question about China, specifically, the human rights situation in China is something that we are regularly raising with partner states bilaterally and in multilateral settings where China is present. And this includes looking to promote accountability for China's genocide and crimes against humanity in Xinjiang, but also human rights abuses across China. Human rights remains at the forefront of our discussions with the PRC and are continuously highlighted in high-level discussions.
Final question, Kylie.
I think this is a question for Ambassador Van Schaak, if that's okay. But my question is, this report talks about a multitude of war crimes that have been committed by Russia in Ukraine. And so I'm wondering if you can bring us up to date on efforts to share U.S. evidence of war crimes committed in Ukraine by the Russians with the ICC, just given, obviously, we saw what they came out with last week regarding one war crime, but the U.S. clearly has evidence of multiple war crimes that have been committed. So can you just update us as to where those conversations and efforts stand?
Yeah, indeed. Last week, a pretrial chamber of the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for President Putin and his children's commissioner, Maria Lvova-Belova, charging both of them with deportation and forced transfer of civilians and specifically of children. So it's a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions, and we've discussed that here when we talked about the crimes against humanity determination that was made. This has now been charged as war crimes. We have appreciated new authorities that Congress has given us when it comes to our ability to interact with the court and to potentially share information. We're looking for ways to be helpful. We generally don't talk about the specifics of what we do share because in many respects that might reveal prosecutorial trajectories, for example, or undermine the safety and security of witnesses. But we are looking for ways to support this, and we have been supporting accountability from the beginning when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine war, in particular supporting the work of the Prosecutor General in Ukraine, who has primary jurisdiction over all of the war crimes and other atrocities being committed there.
Okay, and without getting into specifics over what could be shared or what has been shared, can you just say if at this point any of the evidence that the U.S. has been shared with the ICC?
This is still under consideration.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everybody.